Professor Deb, can you hear my voice clearly?
I can hear you very well. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, we will have. I will allow you to check the sound and also to share the screen, because yesterday we had a little bit difficulties with our colleagues from Maryland to share the screen.
Okay, how's that?
Terrific. I think it's fine. I think it's fine.
Okay.
All right.
Good.
Thank you. Now we would like to start. I will start with Bahasa first, then I will turn to English. I hope it's fine with you.
That's fine with me.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Selamat datang Bapak dan Ibu. Terima kasih telah hadir di hari ketiga. Honorable Professor Deb Niemeyer, I hope I pronounced your name right.
You did.
Thank you. Welcome to our third day of workshop and training on public policy for the future. I'm very happy to welcome everybody, Prof. Deb, and also all participants, and also the colleagues from Jakarta Public Policy Center, and also the Jakarta Human Resource Development Board, and also the rest of Jakarta provincial government colleague. So we are happy now. We are entering the third day, and then today's session, I believe it will be great as well. And then I would like to also introduce our moderator for today. The moderator for today will be Miss Artricia Rashid. She's with us now. She's a member. She's a member of Governance Delivery Unit of Jakarta, and she will lead the discussion in communication with Professor Deb Niemeyer for today. And please, Bapak dan Ibu, if you have any question, just put it in the chat room, then we will actually accommodate this question, and then we'll lead by Miss Icha. Without further ado, let's begin our session. Miss Artricia, time is yours.
Thank you, Mas Fajar. Good morning, everyone. Allow me to welcome all of you, our distinguished speaker, Dr. Deb Niemeyer, and guests from the University of Maryland, America. I would also like to welcome close to 200 participants and mentors from various public sector backgrounds. And of course, I would like to thank the organizer of the Public Policy for the Future International Workshop and Training, the Jakarta Public Policy Institute. So as this is the last day, I think it is important to give some context and tying in some of the past few days of learning, Dr. Deb Niemeyer, so allow me to do that. So today's keynote will culminate the past few days of learning on building and maintaining resilience sustainably. This is a topic which is of great relevance to the context of Jakarta today more than ever. The 3 days have seen us opening new frontiers, igniting new conversations, in hope of creating community of collaboration and excellence in Maryland and in Jakarta, in classrooms, discussions, and beyond. To tie in previous speakers' theme, we have received insights from Professor Christopher Mime on the fundamentals of leaderships and how to plan strategically. From Professor Gerrit Jan Knapp and colleagues, we move forward to plan how to learn on scenarios. So it is with absolute excitement and curiosity that we get to understand now from Professor Niemeyer how we can propel this lesson through her keynote on sustainable cities. So allow me to introduce her. Dr. Niemeyer is the inaugural Clark Distinguished Chair in Energy and Sustainability at the University of Maryland, College Park, where she also served as the professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Setting aside an illustrious career that has spanned decades, her involvement in sustainability actually started way back, showing just how ingrained this cause is for her personally. So allow me, Professor Niemeyer, since I have stalked a bit of your background and learned a bit about you. So Professor Niemeyer grew up in El Paso, Texas in the 1960s and 1970s. She would watch as a little girl a nearby copper smelter releasing pollutants, smoky plumes, and blanketing the city of El Paso, Texas in a haze. Decades later, amid concerns about heightened local levels of lead, zinc, arsenic, the truth finally emerged, right? That the entity, this private sector body that I would not mention what, had been illegally burning hazardous materials. So actually, this notorious polluter spurred her career. It is where everything began. But these days, in 2020, Dr. Niemeyer is still pushing the field of engineering to be more environmentally sustainable and socially just. She received her BS in Civil Engineering from the University of Texas and her PhD in Civil Engineering from the University of Washington. Dr. Niemeyer's early career had focused on transportation modeling. She predicted drivers' behavior, and she considered projected population growth when adding capacity to existing roadway. Transportation modeling has long informed where and how infrastructure gets built. So that is where she is now. In 2014, she was named a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS, for her distinguished contributions to energy and environmental science study and policy development. The AAAS had credited Dr. Niemeyer and her colleagues with helping to protect sensitive populations, such as children attending schools located near roadways, from health hazards that are caused by tailpipe emissions. Her research had demonstrated that minimum acceptable distances were not being calculated correctly. Most importantly, California's state law had changed as a result of her findings. In 2015, she was named a Guggenheim Fellow for foundational work on pro bono service in engineering. In 2017, she was elected to the National Academy of Engineering. But among her services, she was also the former editor-in-chief for Transportation Research, Part A. This is a leading international journal on transportation policies and practices. Notably, Professor Niemeyer is the first woman in the journal's history to hold this position. So finally, Dr. Niemeyer, as a beginner public policy practitioner, as a perennial student, and as a woman myself, I am more than honored to be your moderator, and I am looking forward to learning more from you on how we at Jakarta can be building a more sustainable and equitable city through advocacy and activism, through research and collaboration. Dr. Niemeyer, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that.
My pleasure.
That introduction. I think I need to hire you to work for me on all my introductions.
Gladly, I would gladly do that.
Yes. So I am so pleased to be here and happy that I am able to talk with you all. I went to Bogar a few years ago to the ag school. And I really enjoyed my time in Indonesia. I came home with these beautiful shirts that had been handmade by someone, and this is a very wonderful and fun thing for me to be able to again speak to people from Indonesia and to be here. So what I'm going to do to start us off first is I'm going to say I hope Indonesia is faring better in COVID than the US right now, and that everyone is taking care of everyone. And I want to show you my newest mask. It has a dinosaur.
Oh, wow.
It's my mask. Yeah. So it's handmade with a dinosaur. I saw many masks in the group that were very beautiful. So that's my newest mask. So, okay, so let me get started here. And we should be fine. Okay, so does everyone see the screen okay?
It's okay. We can see that.
Okay. So it's about 9 p.m. here in Washington, D.C. And I just want to start again by saying thank you to everyone. I want to thank the Jakarta and UMD teams that helped to organize the program, Sarah and Aisa for their logistical help. And I hope you've enjoyed the sessions so far. I know the group spent some time learning about the resilience space and definitions and the way cities have deployed resilience improvements. Today, I am going to push you a little bit by spending some time integrating concepts of sustainability, resilience, and push you to think about what it means to have a modern city. We spend a huge amount of time talking about smart cities, but this might not actually be the same as a modern city. So that's where we're going today, to spend some time thinking about a modern city. And the first thing I'm going to do is just take a quick exercise. Everyone take a pen and pencil, just for a minute or two, write down what you believe constitutes a modern city. No more than 1 or 2 sentences, but how you think of a modern city. And I'm going to have a lot of these exercises. Well, not a lot, a few. And if you're there with someone else, you can discuss. But for this one, just take a few minutes and think about, what's a modern city for me? How would I know it if I saw it? And since I can't see everybody, what I'm going to do is just kind of give you 5 minutes and then start in again, or a few minutes and then start in again. Okay, so let's everybody hang on to that, put it to the side. We're going to come back to it later in the talk. Okay, so the way I'm going to organize this talk is to divide it up into 4 parts. And you'll see that towards the end, I return to what's a modern city. And we'll also talk about each of these concepts, what it means for urbanization, what it means to be a smart city, what it means to be a modern city, and then how we think about cities as systems in which we live and we take care of our people. And we'll go through each one of these in stages. Okay, so first thing, the urbanization process. Let me start by characterizing urbanization. You've probably talked a lot about cities. Now I'm gonna push you to define what it means. So urbanization is a gathering together of people and resources, and it's what forms cities. And there have been some very important trends observed the past 20 years or so that are worth reflecting on with respect to urbanization. Cities don't just appear. They form and they grow through migration. And migration can readily be divided up into 2 parts, the rural to urban movement and international movement. And this demographic of migration has been a major contributor to urbanization. Most migrants are found in urban areas, and cities can become magnets for foreign talent, from students to professionals. And in fact, right now, international migration accounts for about 1/3 of urban growth in developed countries. And in those areas in which international migration is changing, the areas are becoming very multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilingual, and this cultural diversity contributes to a city's vibrancy, its prosperity, its inclusiveness, its competitiveness, how attractive it is to the world market, and the overall development of the city. So this international migration is an important part of what constitutes cities. Research has also shown that culturally diverse cities tend to be more innovative because they benefit from a wider range of international knowledge and skills and idea generations. They solve problems differently. Migration that is internal, usually rural to urban migration, often comes from individuals who are seeking opportunity or looking for ways to escape poverty. And we're going to come back to this a lot. And the internal rural to urban migration, it's also been a historical driver of urban growth. And making this transition from rural to urban migration safe and orderly can do 2 things. It can help build the employment base of a city, and it can lift people out of poverty. And when you begin to lift people out of poverty, you tackle the issue of inequality. Okay, so let's talk about this a little bit more. Migration let's say, globally, 1 in 7 people is a migrant. So it's a very, either from an internal migration or an international migration. Indonesia's cities have grown at a faster rate in terms of migration than many other Asian countries. It's been about 4.1% per year. And there are estimates that by 2025, 68% of the Indonesian population will be living in cities. So this is a big migration internally as well as internationally. Now, what's important here, and why I'm going to keep coming back to this, is that Indonesia's GDP has not increased at the same rate as other neighboring countries. In 2016, if you go and look at the World Bank stats, Indonesia was estimated at a GDP of about 4% growth for every 1% urbanization. Now, when you compare these to other Asian countries, India is gaining 13% for every 1% of urbanization. China is at 10%, Thailand's at 7%. So there's a lot of room to really create a prosperous, vibrant urban city. And there's also evidence that the World Bank has just finished in a report that Indonesia's urbanization, the process it's going through now, is not helping to bridge the rich-poor gap. And so if you look at the gap between the richest Indonesians and the poorest, that gap has grown faster than any other country in Southeast Asia. And so when I was looking through, preparing for this lecture, when I was looking through poverty reduction programs and some of the policies in Indonesia, they mostly seemed geared towards rural communities. And that's important. But what happens is the urban poverty rates haven't decreased very much after about 2011, okay? And we're gonna come back to why this is important and how it's connected to migrants. So a few years ago, Pulse Lab Jakarta, which is part of a UN group, interviewed about 300 migrant workers, 300 some migrant workers. And what they found was very large numbers of internal migrants were working in casual or informal sectors. And I want you to also remember this for later. So from this slide, what I want you to take is migration is important to high-functioning cities. The benefits of urbanization are not aggregating in Indonesian cities at the rate cities can actually produce. The informal sector may play a very important role in future prosperity, and cities have to pay attention to patterns of poverty. And this is all part of the bigger picture of urbanization. So let's look a little bit about what's happening here. The estimate is by 2025, approximately 68% of the Indonesian population will be living in cities, okay? Most of these urban dwellers will currently live on Jawa, Bali. And this is the most populous of your 6 island regions and by far the most urbanized. And it's the one I've visited the most. What you can take from these figures is that urbanization overall in Indonesia and on Jawa, Bali is at what is normally considered an intermediate stage of urbanization. And the rest of the country is at much earlier stages of urbanization. And these are based on sort of standard measures of an urbanizing area. And what this suggests is that this is a very important opportunity to take advantage of the agglomeration forces and the easing of congestion pressures to actually work on basic urban services, infrastructure, land and housing markets, and to look at the environment to plan for the future. If these policies don't respond adequately to your current pressures, or worse, if they exacerbate pressures, then they can dampen the potential for prosperity, inclusivity, and livability benefits of urbanizations. So you can ask now, why cities? Who cares about cities, right? Like, it doesn't matter. So why cities? Well, if you think about cities and more generally urban areas, cities are the economic, the political, and the social pulse of a country. The way cities work, especially in developing countries, as firms and people begin to cluster, they start to share amenities and suppliers. They find work, they find workers more easily, they exchange ideas and knowledge more easily, and cities begin to grow. They give better access to markets, and these mechanisms that are called sharing, matching, and learning give rise to strong agglomeration forces that lead to higher productivity and economic growth, and ultimately prosperity. And the relationship between the levels of urbanization and income per capita in Indonesia is consistent with what I've just described. Districts that have a larger share of population living in the urban areas tend to be richer if you measure it by per capita income. When you look at a recent World Bank study, and it was included in the materials I sent to you, you can see that this association of urban areas being richer measured by per capita income is not as strong across Indonesian districts as it is across, if I compare it to other cities or sample countries. So on average, a 1% increase in the share of population living in urban areas is associated with a 1% increase in income per capita in Indonesia. It runs about 4% across other countries. So there's lots of room here to grow, and that's what I want to keep coming back to. Urban areas also provide a higher proportion of formal jobs. And urban areas, especially metro cores and single district metro areas, provide higher paying jobs. And that's great. And this is true no matter where you compare. It's true if you control for differences in sector, educational level, workforce experience, all different kinds of characteristics. Workers in metro areas earn a premium over workers in non-metro areas. And this is consistent with our expectation that people move away from agriculture into higher value added activities as rural areas become more urbanized or as people migrate from rural to urban areas. There's a tendency for policymakers to focus on the generation of high-end value-added services, jobs that tend to have large outputs. The problem is, so thinking about it, just high-end value-added jobs. The problem is that this sector also tends to employ fewer people. For example, high-end value services account for about 20% of output in urban areas on average, but they account for about only 12% of jobs. Even in the Jakarta metro area, where high-end value-added services make up about 35% of the economy, you can see that only about 24% of workers are actually employed in these activities. So you want this mix of high-end and low-end service, value-added service jobs throughout your city. Okay, so let me go to the next slide here. There we go. Okay, so now what we know, all right? We know that there are inefficiencies in the urban areas because of the way cities grow. As people move to cities, growth can occur horizontally, meaning a city expands outwardly, or vertically, meaning a city densifies. Cities that grow vertically tend to do better in terms of providing adequate infrastructure and stronger economies, with the caveat that cities become more crowded. And that means that the infrastructure must still be able to support basic needs like clean drinking water and sanitation. So as cities grow, housing, affordable housing, labor, services, all that becomes more complicated. There's more pressure on land, commercial real estate, housing markets. There's also pressure on the transportation networks. This shows itself in congestion, which, as I remember from Jakarta, there was a bunch of congestion when I was there. The urban poor are also less likely to enjoy the economic benefits of societies that increase unequally. And because of this, they in turn can't contribute their economic value to the urban economy, and they're also more likely to suffer more. So what I want to get here is that housing, let's just take housing as an infrastructure. There was a recent UN Habitat study that found that only 13% of the world's cities have affordable housing, 13%. and that the rest of people in cities spend way too much of their incomes on housing. And that means the rest of that income cannot go towards savings or towards consumption, which helps to increase the economic engine of a city. The poor in the urban areas are especially vulnerable to being cost burdened. In OECD countries, for instance, more than 40% of low-income owners have a mortgage that takes up, or a rent that takes up more than 40% of their disposable income. So 40% of your income goes to housing. That is not sustainable in developing countries, urban areas. It's barely sustainable in developed countries, urban areas. And then as housing prices increase, priced out residents move further away from the city. And this is especially true for the urban poor who end up living in these peri-urban areas, rings around the city. And this is called horizontal growth. And it results in less urban productivity and large inefficiencies. It's harder to provide housing, it's harder to provide transportation, it's harder to provide services, and you begin to see a cycle of poverty. And that's why it's so important that cities don't grow outward, they grow upward. The sustainable densities that ensure an upward growth can be achieved through things like multi-story dwellings, better use of commercial buildings. You can make cities, you can reconfigure already dense settlements in cities to also make them more livable and productive. And I want to bring in COVID here because in the early stages of the pandemic, there was a lot of research that people were saying dense cities are suffering more from COVID. There were more cases in COVID, and people were like, in America, people are like, I got to move out of the city. But that's actually turns out not to be quite right. It turns out that the problem is that more people are living within the same structure. And these are largely the urban poor. So they have more people in a structure, one gets sick, and the COVID passes very quickly among the other inhabitants in the structure. So too many people in a single housing structure. And that happens because there's not enough affordable housing. So sustainable cities are going to look for opportunities to grow vertically in a way that also meets sort of physical distancing needs. And this is going to require some imagination. It's not gonna come easy. And when cities don't do this and they start looking horizontally, then what happens is you have a lot of issues. So Jakarta has tended to grow horizontally. I was looking at, I should have made some pictures of these, but satellite images of Jakarta's growth over time. And it's tended to grow this way. And one result is there's been this huge loss of green space in the city since it's over its growth time. And so the density is horizontal, not vertical. And what that means is that lots of land and housing, you need a lot of space for it, and you don't have the infrastructure to serve it. So that's a problem with horizontal. Because Jakarta is one of the mega cities, I think it's around 30 million the last time I looked in the greater metropolitan area. It's really important to have planned growth. And to have planned growth, especially because you're in an earthquake vulnerable region and you have flooding, and you also have a groundwater problem. So all these things are very important to consider when you're trying to think about how to grow and to be proactive. So now at this point, we've established that urban areas are important generators. That important generators of prosperity, and that if horizontal growth isn't managed, meaning that cities can just spread out, this is going to affect the kinds of infrastructure that you're going to need to support your economic growth. It's going to make it considerably more expensive, and it's going to be less efficient for the growth of the city's economic prosperity. All right. Let's do this next exercise, which is to take just a few minutes, and I want you to think about where you live. It can be a village, a city, and think about, has it grown horizontally or vertically? Then I want you to make a list of the infrastructure in your village or city or metro area and grade each infrastructure. A, B, C, D needs improvement using this criteria here. And then I want you to, final question is, which infrastructures have been stretched as a result of growth in the urban areas? So just take a few minutes and do these three, and I'll give you a 1-minute countdown. And if you have a question, you should unmute and ask me. It will be fine. And when you've finished, if you look up, then I'll know you kind of be able to keep track of who's done. I love all the comments, the chat's definitions of modern cities, by the way. I'm kind of reading them as I go. They're very interesting. Yeah, so think about, does it grow horizontally or vertically? And then, you know, what are the infrastructure that are available and how have they been stretched as a result of growth? And if you have an interesting, you want to say it, unmute and tell us all what you're thinking. That's also very helpful. I'm trying very hard to keep everyone awake.
I don't think you should be worried about that. It's morning in here, Prof. So.
Oh, that's true. That's a good point.
Must be hard for you. We're sorry for that.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Okay, it looks like everybody's looked up. Anybody not ready? Shake your head no if you want a few more minutes. Okay, we got a few no's. Lots of horizontals. Lots and lots of horizontals, it looks like. Very interesting. Okay, so let's go on to the next step and think about, we'll come back to this. We're gonna do each exercise and then come back to what we thought about early on. Okay, so now I'm gonna ask you a question about what is a smart city? Yeah, what is a smart city? Yeah. One possible answer to the kinds of problems that people face in managing urban growth has been this concept of a smart city, right? But many of us, me included, have asked, what exactly is a smart city, right? Like, what does it mean to have a smart city? So on this slide, what I want to show you is on the left, McKinsey, you have one answer from McKinsey, and what they say a smart city is that it's a turning point for cities and that it puts people at the center. But they don't ever really give a definition about what a smart city is. People at the center is about as good as it gets. On the other, and I should say, for people who don't know who McKinsey is, they're a US firm, but they're very influential globally. They were founded in 1926 and have worked all over the world, and they advise governments on strategic management. And they also advise corporations, but they do a lot of government work. So on the right, what you see is another perspective that came from the Bloomberg City Lab group. And Bloomberg is the investment firm, and they own this company called City Lab. And City Lab reports on the world's cities and communities and neighborhoods. And they look at how cities are actually working, what challenges they face, the solutions they need. So they're very on the ground kind of reporting. You might think of McKinsey as the dreamer who wants cities to focus on the way to be home to the internet of all things, and collecting hordes and hordes of data that probably require you to hire McKinsey to analyze the data, but also result in cities that are more efficient and prosperous. If we think about City Lab, they would be the realist. They're interested in the problems cities face every day. They're nervous about privacy and rights to data and thinking about how to improve quality of life. Okay, so these are the two definitions you see over and over about smart cities, and neither one of them really help you to understand what a smart city is. So I have an idea about what a smart city is, and I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about what I think a smart city is these days. And it's a little bit different from either of these definitions. All right, so hang on a minute, okay. I think that there are other ways in which cities can be smart. And these ways in which cities can be smart, can you guys see this? Is everything okay? I'm getting a blinking on my screen. Is it all right?
It's all right, Prof.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I don't know why it just changed it. Okay, so I'm going to show you that I'm going to talk to you about a crowdsourcing map is a way in which cities are smarter. So today, maps are being built by citizens all over the world. They're kind of like a Wikipedia style map. There's volunteers who collect satellite images that I've helped with in Africa to online maps and put these images on maps in their spare time, to people in their neighborhoods collecting GPS coordinates, to citizens participating in collecting and analyzing data that's relevant to their community or neighborhood. And I'm sure most of you know about OpenStreetMap. They've been collecting collectively mapping across the world with incredible detail across cities and countries, some of them for the first time. This improves resilience. This is a smart city. When a crisis hits, the online community, sometimes tens of thousands strong, can map against the clock in a way that no government can take on. And mapping becomes something that takes hours rather than weeks. And so here I'm going to give you an example of a company that I'm actually very close to. And it was a citizen mapping initiative taken by Kathmandu Living Labs, and I'll call them KLL. And it was where they work is in the really densely populated Kathmandu Valley. So it's almost as many people as Jakarta. So in April of 2015, the earthquake hit Nepal, and KLL started mapping everything. They started off working in a parking lot because it was too risky to go into their building. And so they just started mapping. They started mapping buildings that fell down. They started mapping roads that were inaccessible. And the response, and they started uploading it to OpenStreetMap, and the response exploded. Within days, KLL was the center of a worldwide team that was tens of thousands strong. I had 3 students from Nepal at the time in my research group. They were doing mapping in the US using satellite imagery so that KLL would have information about where structures were. The global volunteers, they worked from satellite images, and they updated OpenStreetMaps as fast as they could. His staff scraped images of damage from social media and walked the streets of Kathmandu. And at the end of the day, they were providing damage maps to local responders, to the Nepalese military, to MAP Action and the UN. So this wasn't a government thing. This was a small company who drew upon a really smart technology. And Nepal was the first emergency place in which a local group like this took a lead role. And traditionally, this kind of mapping, along with the data collection, the needs assessment, analysis, has always been done by governments and big international aid agencies. But this digital revolution and availability of open source material means local groups like KLL are now able to just demonstrate ways in which they can serve. And this crowdsourcing phenomena has really changed disaster response. It's introduced a completely different model. And now there is the ability to go out to the crowd, and it'll go from strength to strength. It'll get stronger and it'll get stronger. So here's another example of this. Ramani Hirari has been training students in Dar es Salaam. The university gets these students, teaches them 21st century technical skills, and in return, they generate very high precision, low cost data that's used for flood prediction and preparedness. Just recently, like in September and October, the university worked really closely with Tanzania Resilience Academy, and they trained 200 students from 3 different universities, and they were able to give them field mapping experience while they went out and collected flood data in flood-prone areas in Dar es Salaam. The students worked with local community members from 20 different wards, and they collected data on the extent and depth of water when it floods. And then they built these models for river cross-section surveys to help improve the city flood model. And in turn, the city flood model is being used to prepare for future flooding. They gave each student a very low-cost dual-frequency receiver that they used to collect ground control points using precision point positioning technique, and providing data with a very high level of positional accuracy that could be used then against drone imagery to actually get exact coordinates. And this enabled the city to get better delineation of potential catchment areas. And in turn, the students were taught these great skills using low-cost equipment that's readily available. Now, when I look at these two things, I think this is a pretty smart city. This is a pretty smart effort. But I have another one to show you, even more so. But I'm going to show you where a country as developed as the US is, and as much access as we have, I'm going to show you why these things often don't work very well. So it's in US, we are trying to talk across infrastructure. We're rapidly learning that it's impossible to focus on a single problem. So in the last two, you had a natural disaster and you had a social problem of mapping that disaster. And we're trying to learn how to deal with more than one problem, because the problems you face are often connected or overlap with each other. And to show you this, I'm going to give you a very simple example. When we think about school travel from a transportation perspective, if I'm a transportation person, I think, are they biking or are they being driven in a car? I'm thinking about the choices they're making that will keep them healthy. If you go and talk to somebody at a school in the US and you say, the people who actually run the school, you ask them about transportation, what they say is they just want to make sure everybody knows the choices that are available. But the question of who gets to school safely and who doesn't is never brought about. And this is because no one running the schools talks to anyone running transportation. But when cities innovate with some of these open street mapping and these open source platforms, you can begin to solve more than one problem at a time, and you can leapfrog mistakes that other places have made. And I'm going to show you a quick example of something in, here we go. Okay, so this is a BRT development, and it's a very interesting case of a city that grew horizontally, okay? So TransMilenio, it was a BRT, it's in Bogota. It grew up very quickly. It was started it opened in 2000, and by 2001, every new month they brought online new stations and more buses. And at the beginning, it was just brilliant. It really met a need. By 2002, the system had reached probably about 45 kilometers. And user satisfaction, this is the thing, I wrote about this in the early 2000s. User satisfaction was at 90%. I mean, people loved this system. The agency staff were really committed to delivering a service that was respectful of sort of life, quality of life issues, diversity. They were not trying to reach just poor, just older. They wanted to reach everyone and create a system that was affordable for users. And so this mass transit bus system was a novelty back then, and it was inspired, to be honest, by bus systems in Brazil and Ecuador. But the BRT in Bogota was like a bus system on steroids. It was huge. It had 5 bus docking bays. It has double bus passing lanes. It has express routes. It's the largest, it used to be the largest capacity BRT in the world. It was able to carry up like 48,000 passengers in each direction on a major corridor that had only carried about 30,000 passengers. So this BRT was not only a technological leap, but it was an institutional transformation, right? Before the BRT, the public bus system in Bogota was owned, basically one owner per bus. And they worked very extended hours, no benefits. They competed on the street for every passenger. So it was like a hawking system. And with the BRT, the bus drivers then were formed into companies. The companies received what were called limited time concessions and were required to, own and maintain fleets, hire drivers and staff, and actually comply with labor laws. And so companies had rents they had to pay, they paid taxes and local taxes on industry. And so that begins to create a cycle of prosperity. Now, when Bogota's BRT was originally put in, everybody recognized it. And lots of cities began their own BRT. And it's been used for a reference, even in Jakarta's BRT system. But I will say, 20 years later, that the BRT faces very, very serious problems. In 2018, a user satisfaction survey that they did showed that only 13% of the riders were actually happy with the BRT. Remember when I told you in the first 3 years it was 90%. 2 years ago in 2018 when they did the survey, it was 13%. And what happened was, if you look at this, you can see the city of Bogota expand horizontally. And once it starts expanding horizontally, it becomes more and more and more expensive to make investments in the system and to maintain the system. And you have to invest more money in the system because you've expanded the city in which it's operating outward significantly. Okay, so let me give you one more example, and this one returns to the mapping example inside of Indonesia. And this is another one that I really liked from Pulse Lab in Jakarta. Near the end of September, there was a big COVID case sort of reconciliation, and Indonesia had, I don't know, I don't remember exactly, but it was like 275,000 COVID cases since the beginning of March. And so Pulse Lab Jakarta started working with a digital service company called Jabar. And what they were doing was mapping vulnerabilities. And I'm going to call Jabar, you know, it's sort of a company that was established to help narrow the digital divide within the province and help communities take up technology both in their community life and through government. And one of Jabar's key mandates is to improve the efficiency and accuracy of data and policy making in West Java. So what they did was Pulse Lab, Jakarta, and Jabar hooked up together, and they did some very interesting things. They used the village potential census, PODES, to get an understanding of the structural factors that could affect the transmission of COVID. And they came up with these new metrics for identifying the potential transmission of COVID and the transmission risk. And then, this is the really cool part. They went to Facebook's population density map, and they integrated the PODES data with the Facebook data to get a population density score at the village level. And you can get to Facebook's population density map through the humanitarian data exchange. It's called the HDX, and it's available to everybody. And it's part of Facebook's data for a good program. And it gets updated every couple of years. So the last time it was updated was in 2018. So you can begin to see, whoops, sorry, I forgot to change the slide here. So let me show you. You can begin to see where this vulnerability mapping started taking place by combining densities and COVID risk. You can look for ways to shut down smaller parts of the economy because you know who's most vulnerable for the COVID cases. This is pretty darn smart. I mean, this is a smart city to me. This is a smart effort. Okay, so let's summarize what I think is a smart city. I think smart cities have government, citizens, and civil society that work together in a two-way conversation to co-create solutions. In all the examples I've given you, the community was working also with government and as part of civil society to co-create a university. Smart cities leverage this new technology and the open source availability of data. Smart cities look at social problems in two or more dimensions. You don't just solve congestion. You solve congestion thinking about who needs access to what. So you always are looking for two problems to solve, not just congestion, but congestion for who. All right. I also think that smarter cities work towards identifying where they're vulnerable, and they use open source data and community-based data collection to build this understanding. You can't, nowhere, even in the US, you can't pay enough to collect the kind of data that the global crowdsourcing and the community members collected in any of my examples. So in other words, you must have citizens help you collect data and help you understand the problems that they are facing. And all of this, when you bring this whole package together, then smarter cities seem to innovate in a certain kind of way that solves multiple problems, okay? Not just one problem, but multiple problems.